Hello and welcome, everybody. Let's get started. It's 12 o'clock, which means it's time for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Smith. I am your host for the program most Wednesdays at noon. This is the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences YouTube channel. You've made it. Thanks for joining us in today's program. The Lunchtime Discovery Series, though, is brought to you by the folks over in the Office of Environmental Education. There, I said their name right, within the Department of Environmental Quality. They look around, find cool people doing interesting things out there in the world of science and nature. And then we use our resources here at the Museum of Natural Sciences in order to host and broadcast these programs live to you on the internet so that we can all gather around the glow of our YouTube screens and hear some fascinating stories and most likely learn something new. We have a great time at these programs. One of my favorite things about the Lunchtime Discovery Series, though, is that they are interactive. So it's not just me and the guest speakers who are doing this program. All of our viewers get to participate as well. The way that you do that is jump into the chat here on YouTube, or if you're not, in the YouTube chat, you can use other social media and use the hashtag Lunchtime Discovery so you can send posts. We've got people monitoring those so they can make sure that if you've got questions and you post them on Instagram or X or something like that, they can make their way over here to me. So lots of ways to participate in today's program. But I'm so glad that you're all here and ready for what I think is going to be a fascinating topic today. For today's Lunchtime Discovery Series, I want you all to meet a professor of biology at East Carolina University. Everybody say hi to Dr. Jeffrey McKinnon. Hi, Dr. McKinnon. Welcome.
Hey, thanks so much, Chris. I'm thrilled to be here.
So just a few months ago, you had a new book published called Our Ancient Lakes. What's the 15-second pitch for the book?
So this book describes a class of biodiversity hotspot that most people don't know about, but it is to fresh water, I would say, as coral reefs are to the oceans or tropical forests are to land. So it's an extraordinary treasure trove of natural history that I'm hoping to get more people excited about.
Okay, fascinating stuff. Well, that certainly whets my appetite. I'd say let's get into it.
Okay, here we go. Let me get everything running. So let's see here. One more thing. There we go. So this is the cover of my recent book, Our Ancient Lakes, which I'm going to tell you about today. There's a bit of a story behind how I got going on the book, and I'll tell you a little bit about that as well. So thanks so much for having me, and I'm really pleased to be here. I'm going to start with a little Q&A to see, just trying to get rid of, oops. Got a little something on my screen I wish would disappear, but it will shortly. Anyway, we're going to do a little Q&A to see what folks might know about ancient lakes already. So I'm going to begin, and of course, I won't be able to hear the answers, but I'll do this a little bit rhetorically, and you can think about these questions. Which of these is an ancient lake? I'm going to start with Lake Michigan, which is, of course, one of the North American Great Lakes up on the just below the border with Canada. Ancient lake, well, it's big, it's pretty deep, it's got a lot of interesting animals in it, but is it ancient? Not actually. The Great Lakes, the North American Great Lakes, are all only about 10 or 12,000 years old. So they appeared when the glaciers retreated, and an awful lot of the planet's lakes have that kind of history. Lake Tanganyika in East Central Africa, ancient? Yeah. So Lake Tanganyika is about 10 million years old. It's got an astonishing diversity of organisms that are found only in that lake that we're going to be talking about soon. Lake Victoria, what do you think? Ancient or not ancient? Well, Victoria is a bit of an enigma. It's in a pretty old basin, something like 400,000 years old, but it's dried up and refilled a few times over the millennia. Most recently, about 20,000 years ago, it dried up almost completely. All that was left was some swamps and ponds, and it only refilled about 16,000 years ago. And yet it too, like Tanganyika, has an astonishing diversity of certain groups of fishes. So how could that be in such a short period of time? And that's one of the interesting things about these lakes that we'll be talking about today. Most ancient lakes have a different history than the lakes that we're more familiar with. So a lot of the world's lakes have this kind of post-glacial origin, like I mentioned. Some are just where a river has a bend in it and slows down. And these sorts of lakes typically have lifetimes on the order of thousands or tens of thousands of years and will fill in with silt fairly rapidly. But a much smaller number of lakes around the world have a origin in the movements of portions of the Earth's crust and plate tectonics. And so you'll often find these graben sorts of structures in ancient lakes where a piece of the Earth's crust is sinking down between two other portions. And so that's going to take a very long time to fill. If it's in a wet area, that's going to form a lake that will have a long life and may even continue to deepen even as it is filling with silt. Others have half grabens, which also form a depression. So both of these kinds of processes and some other similar sorts of geological processes can result in these lakes that can last millions or even tens of millions of years. How old is old enough to be considered ancient? There's no simple definition or agreement on this point. Stephanie Hampton wrote a paper a couple of years ago where she tried to come up with a less arbitrary definition than, say, 1,000,000 years, which is one that sometimes folks have used. And what she went with was a lake that's lasted at least one glacial cycle. So since the last interglacial, about 130,000 years ago, she considered that to be ancient. And that's, fair enough and kind of reasonable. If you use that kind of definition, you get something like 30 lakes scattered around the planet. The thing about that is that you end up with some lakes that ancient lake researchers wouldn't consider that exciting because they don't have a lot of native endemic biodiversity found only in those lakes. So it's a smaller set of lakes that ancient lake researchers really focus on. And in those lakes, you often have faunas that are very distinctive, found nowhere else, and in many cases are also really reminiscent of what you find in the ocean. So some of these old lakes, people have speculated, must have had some kind of recent connection to the ocean and be just a bunch of marine forms that somehow found themselves in fresh water. But that's not really what seems to have happened in most cases. So if you look at this crab, this to me looks a lot like some of the crabs that I saw in shallow waters of the North Pacific when I was growing up in British Columbia. But it's not. It's a few inches across. It's got a gigantic, crushing claw. But in fact, this crab is not from the ocean. This is from a lake in the middle of Sulawesi, from Lake Matano. And we think that the reason it's got these really huge claws is to eat snails, which live in the lake, which in turn have evolved really thick shells to defend themselves against the crabs. So there's been this coevolution, as we put it, between the crabs and the snails, each escalating in offensive abilities and in defense. And we've seen this happen in a couple of places. So in Lake Tanganyika, a long ways away from Sulawesi, you find similar crabs and snails. And in both cases, you find crabs that look awfully marine and snails, especially in Tanganyika, that you'd swear were marine in origin. So this is one of the features that we often see in these systems. Another feature we often see is collections of many species, frequently extraordinary numbers, of fishes, often colorful small fishes that have diversified rapidly and are found only in one particular lake. Here's an image from Lake Matano, where I used to work in Sulawesi, where we find these telmathurinid fishes, around 10 or so in Lake Matano, that are diversified right there with many beautiful colors and occupying quite a range of ecological roles in the lake. And what's neat there is that those fish are found only in that particular lake. And if you go less than 20 miles away downstream to Lake Tawuti, on the same island, also on Sulawesi, you'll find another lake, Tawuti, and it too has telmathurinid fishes, not quite as many species, that are found only in that lake. So these lakes, which are extremely close to each other, have no species in common in these telmathurinids. And this is, again, a sort of feature that we often find in ancient lake systems, this extraordinary level of what we call endemism, where organisms are confined to just one particular lake or place. An even more extreme example is in Africa, where we find the cichlids of Lake Malawi. Some of these people might have seen in aquarium shops because they are really popular and are exported extensively, because there are hundreds of species of them with all manner of extraordinary colors and all manner of interesting ecological roles, from eating algae off the rocks like we see here, to eating scales from each other, eating other fish, eating tiny prey that live in the open water. So astonishing ecological diversity combined with great beauty and great color diversity in Lake Malawi, and we'll be talking more about that lake. It's not just the fish that have diversified and have evolved into many really attractive forms. Here is a shrimp from a tailed shrimp from Sulawesi, from ancient lakes in Sulawesi again. And we find in these shrimps extraordinary range of colors, which have made them somewhat popular with aquarists, which can cause some issues through overcollection. So we've got this red and white all the way to the far end of the spectrum with blues. And here's one of my favorites that has this delicate orange and white striped pattern. But what I find really striking about this one is that in addition to the very pretty orange and white, we have this turquoise. I think these are eggs, which looks like they were photoshopped in there. It looks completely implausible that this creature would have such a different, color right there. But my German colleagues who took the photo assure me that it's real. You can go further north to Siberia and Lake Baikal, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And there you can find not shrimp, but amphipods. These are gammarids. So these are the sort of creatures that fishermen in North America would refer to as scuds and might use as bait. But here in North America, they're kind of dull little gray-brown creatures typically found in springs, great for bait and fun for introductory biology classes, but not especially noteworthy for their colors. But in the shallows of Lake Baikal, you find these marvelous color polymorphisms in the amphipods. And the really remarkable thing about the amphipods of Lake Baikal is that they're found at the surface, where you can collect these guys all the way to more than a mile deep in the barren depths of the lake, where there are species that are specialized for living there, and also in the open water. So there's this remarkable diversification of over 250 species of gammarids, of these amphipods, in Lake Baikal, in addition to other groups. It's not all little creatures. In many of the lakes, you'll find some large predators. Crocodiles are found in some of the African lakes and some of the Southeast Asian ones. You know what, though, they're not really as interesting biologically, because you never find 10 or 15 or 20 species of crocodile that are diversified in a lake. Typically, there's just one. And so from a biological perspective, they're a little bit boring, but from a perspective of field work, they're not so boring. And you have to pay close attention, especially the saltwater crocodiles. Those are truly nasty creatures. Ancient lakes first came to the attention of biologists in a substantial way in 1950 with the publication of this marvelous paper, Speciation in Ancient Lakes, by John Langdon Brooks. And this is a pretty well-cited paper. It's had a fair bit of attention over the years, but what's always frustrated me a little bit, and partly led to the book, was that, I knew all about this paper, and there are even conferences every few years that are held by folks who work in ancient lakes, where we get together, 100 or so of us, and talk about these systems. And I would come back from these meetings and tell my colleagues about the wondrous things that I'd learned about, some ancient lake in Africa or in Japan. And they would often look at me a little bit blankly. The term ancient lake just isn't all that familiar. So I feel like even though we've known about them for a long time, they're just this underappreciated class of biodiversity hotspot in fresh water. So how then is it that I happened across ancient lakes and started to work on these systems? That's a curious story that starts with my favorite uncle, my Uncle Jack Thompson, who was originally from Manitoba, Canada, where a lot of my family are from. And he worked for a long time right here in Thompson, Manitoba, along with my Uncle Brent and their families. There's a nickel mine there, and it's still operating today, I believe. So they made their living there. And one day their bosses came to them, these guys from small town northern Canada, and said, how would you like to move to Indonesia for a while, to the island of Sulawesi, and help us start a nickel mine there? And so they said, all right. They moved to Indonesia. And that was in the late 1970s. Nickel mining continues to be extremely important in Indonesia. It's got its start really around that time. And in those days, and actually we're into the 1980s now, when I was finishing high school and starting university, I had free airline flights. My father was a pilot, and so I could travel, but I didn't have any money. So my modus operandi was to go and catch a flight to my most distant relatives with a full fridge and an empty bed and kind of sponge off them for a while. So Jack was my most distant relation. So I went and saw him and my uncle Brent here in Sorowako, Indonesia. Here is Lake Matano, surrounded by beautiful forest. Here is the town of Sorowako, where Jack and Brent and their families and expatriates from all over, and also quite a number of Indonesians lived working on the mine. Here's the mine. It's kind of a nasty looking thing where they are clearing a lot of forest and soil. So it's quite an unpleasant business. I went there and I was just starting university, and I had a little bit of equipment I'd borrowed from the entomology collection at the University of British Columbia, where I was starting my studies. And I went and collected some insects in the forest. I asked local people, both Indonesians and the expatriates, well, what about the lake? Is there anything interesting I should look in the lake? Because I really was planning to become a fish biologist. And they said, nah, there's nothing in the lake. Don't bother with that. Go down to the coast, and there's corals on the coast and all kinds of great fish there. So I took their word for it. We did a bit of swimming and boating, but I never really paid very much attention to the fish in the lake. And it turns out that was quite a mistake, because I came back and started my career and was working on stickleback fish, which I still work on. It's been really important research system for me over the years. But as I was working on the sticklebacks, I came across this book, The Ecology of Sulawesi, and from a sense of sort of nostalgia and my nice memories of Sulawesi, I bought it and started looking at it. And I discovered that, boy, what folks had told me there was wrong. There are actually super interesting fish found in that lake. I've already showed you a few of them. And so I decided to go back. So I'd become a professor by that point, and I decided I'd go back and start a research program here in Lake Matano, which is in the middle of Sulawesi right here, which kind of sits between Australia and Southeast Asia. And I worked there for some years with Suzanne Gray, who did a PhD with me and who is now a faculty member herself, and my dear old friend Fadli Tantu, and Larry Dill, and various other folks. And what we mainly did was we'd swim around watching fish. So the fish lived in shallow, clear, beautiful waters. And we would take these video cameras and record their behavior and make measurements of the light and the colors of the fish. And we were trying to understand how the fish color patterns evolve, how their behaviors evolve, how they have diversified. And that was quite successful. We produced some nice papers, and Suzanne got a good PhD, and everything was going well. But the thing is that the whole time I was there, the place was kind of going downhill all around me. So this is Peter Hehanusa, my old friend, who was a senior scientist in the Indonesian government. Peter and I look kind of cranky because we've just come back from having a look at this dam that was being constructed that you can see here on the outlet of Lake Matano. It was the second dam in the system. And we were worried about that, but Peter was also very worried just about how all this road construction, especially all the way around the lake where roads were eventually built, might affect the watershed and the lake itself. One of the things that we were worried about was introductions of non-native species, and that's because we'd started to see them already. So we saw this tambaki, this member of the piranha family. It's kind of more of a vegetation eater, but it's used in aquaculture. We found one of those in the lake. We found an African cichlid. We saw various other species that seemed to have become established already, maybe for a very long time. And we were worried that something might arrive that would cause a real problem. So we undertook this education campaign, putting up posters and giving talks locally to inform folks about the dangers of throwing their pets or releasing their aquaculture animals into the lake. And, I think we probably did a bit of good. We probably slowed things down a little bit, but it wasn't enough, because it was only a little while after that, in the 2010s, that this creature arrived, the flower horn cichlid, which is an aquarium fish. It has no other utility, really. It's a fish that's been manufactured from hybridization between different species for the aquarium trade. And they've actually become established in a number of places now. And boy, they took to Lake Matano pretty well, and they're eating just about everything in it and competing with a lot of the other species as well. It looks like a couple of snail species have already probably gone extinct since this fish arrived just in the 2010s, getting really substantially established. So that was pretty tough news. And I was hearing stories about this sort of thing going on all over the world in ancient lakes all around the globe. And so I started to think, maybe I need to do a little something more than the occasional outreach campaign. Maybe I should augment my research with a bit more of an effort on conservation and communication and bringing to people's awareness the value of these systems. So I had this idea for writing a book about ancient lakes. And so in 2007, I was just starting to think about that. And I was talking to a book agent. And then I got this email from East Carolina University. I was living in Wisconsin at the time, my first job. I got this email from East Carolina University asking me to apply to be chair of the department there of biology. So that seemed like a good opportunity. So I did that. That's been a great job, but running a big biology department, especially at the start of a fiscal crisis, is not going to leave you time for writing popular science books. So I had to set that whole business aside for longer than I hoped. So this book has had a long gestation, but in 2018, I gave up the chair work and was able to return to it. And I'm really pleased to have now had it come out. What I want to do next is tell you a little bit about some of the most important lakes and introduce them a little bit further. We're going to begin with Lake Baikal, which is kind of hard to get to now. Siberia is a little bit inaccessible the way things are going in terms of our relations with Russia. But if you ever get the chance, boy, you want to go to Lake Baikal. You'll often hear its age quoted as 25 million years. The lake in its earliest form extends back probably as far as 70 million years when there were two separate basins. Today, it is the largest by volume and deepest lake in the world, with 20% of the liquid fresh water on the surface of the planet, which is just mind-boggling. And that age means that in Baikal's earliest form, it very likely had creatures like Amurasaurus, the Siberian dinosaur, on its shores. So there's been plenty of time for radiations of gamma-ray amphipods and sculpins and various other creatures to evolve in the lake. There are no dinosaurs there today, I'm sorry to say, except for birds, which are the modern form of dinosaurs. But there are still some pretty cool large animals. In particular, there is the world's only species of entirely freshwater seal. It's confined to Lake Baikal, the Nerpa, this marvelous creature, which remarkably continues to do pretty okay through hunting and all manner of stresses. Lake Tanganyika, we've mentioned, about 10 million years old, with radiations of various different groups, including most notably the cichlid fish. There are about 240 species of cichlid in Lake Matano, Lake Tanganyika, which is a lot in 10 million years. But more remarkably is the lake just to the south of it, Lake Malawi. Lake Malawi is younger than Tanganyika, about 1 million years old in its current form, to the best of our abilities to estimate that. And Lake Malawi has over 800 species of cichlid. These numbers can be hard to interpret without a little bit of context. So let me tell you that 800 species of cichlid, so one group of fish in that one lake, is more than there are species of mammal in the whole United States, or species of reptile, or species of amphibian, including both frogs and salamanders and toads and all of the above. So that one lake, less than 1 million years old, or approximately 1 million years old, has far more fish than all these different ancient groups in a whole large nation of the United States. But there's more. So Lake Victoria is even stranger. So Lake Victoria, I've mentioned, really only about 16,000 years old. We're pretty sure. There were some doubts about these numbers, but we're pretty sure that's about its age. And at its peak, it's experienced some extinctions the last few decades, but at its peak, it had around 500 species of cichlids. So it's not clear that we should consider Victoria ancient or not, but it clearly has some extraordinary biodiversity that we have to explain somehow or other. The Malili Lakes I've already mentioned. These are the lakes in the center of Sulawesi that I've worked on. There's some other ancient lake systems near there as well. Sulawesi is a really remarkable place in terms of its biogeography. I want to mention Titicaca because that is the highest ancient lake. It's found in the Andes on the border between Peru and Bolivia, and it has radiations of amphipods, again, snails and pupfish. And I just want to mention briefly the Caspian Sea. So why would I be showing you a sea in a slide that's about ancient lakes? It's because the designation sea versus lake is a little bit arbitrary. So we usually think of a lake as being a body of water that has no direct marine connection to the world's oceans. And so the Caspian Sea, by that definition, is a lake. It's a salty one, but it's a lake. And the Caspian Sea also has some really interesting diversifications within it. So that's a little tour of the lakes and some of the more remarkable creatures found within them. But the lakes are not just interesting as, sort of aquariums or zoos of natural history. They are also telling us some unexpected and really interesting things about the processes that produce biological diversity. First off, about the ecological causes of diversity. And when we talk about the ecology of biodiversity, what we're usually talking about is adaptive radiation, which is rapid diversification of a single ancestor into new species through natural selection, which we think arises mainly from some form of ecological opportunity and the different environments that are associated with that opportunity. The most famous example comes from the Galapagos finches, where there have been many fantastic and really in-depth studies of exactly how natural selection operates on birds with different types of beaks, which are adapted for different sorts of seeds, and how that's generated new species of Galapagos finch. So that's a really important body of work. But it can also be really valuable to look more broadly and to compare systems with different levels of diversity and ask, what are the correlates? What seems to have caused extreme and particularly high levels of diversity and numbers of species in some systems, but not caused them in others? And so if adaptive radiation is a key to that process, then we should be able to identify correlates. If we look at lots of lakes and look at cichlids in lots of lakes, as has been done by Katie Wagner across Africa using both ancient and younger lakes and some nearby land masses as well. So she has asked if we look at all these different systems and ask, where do we find the most species and what features of the ecology of the lakes accompany that? Is it the case that ecological opportunity seems to have driven the highest levels of biological diversity? So is ecological opportunity important? Well, the simple answer is yes. What Katie has shown is that you find the highest numbers of species, especially in deep lakes. So lake depth is a variable, and the depth of water in general is a variable of critical importance to fish in terms of determining the ecological features that are present. And so where there are deeper lakes, there's a wider range of ecologies for fish to occupy and then encourage their diversification. Energy is also important. So is there a lot of photosynthesis? Is there a lot of energy to support a lot of creatures? And then it turns out that lake age is also an important feature. It was kind of satisfying if one is interested in ancient lakes. So those are the ecological features that seem to be important to high levels of diversification to give us a lot of species. But it's not just ecology, it would seem. So Katie and her colleagues also found that strong sexual selection and mate choice are important. So if you look at the features of the cichlids themselves, it's those lineages in which you find really substantial differences between male and female coloration, where maybe typically the males are brilliantly colored and the females less so, and a lot of variation in male color, together with female preferences for such colors. Those lineages that possess those kinds of features also seem to have diversified more readily and more rapidly. And sometimes this sort of these characteristics accompany ecological opportunity. So for example, you can have some cichlids in which within a single species, there can be two different color patterns in the males. Sometimes these are found at, for example, different depths in the lake. And so it can be quite easy then for females who have strong color preferences to diversify as well and to accompany and to evolve preferences for one color pattern or the other, or indeed the evolution of female sensory characteristics and preferences may drive the diversification of the males. So this color variation and this evolution of mating preferences accompanies ecological variation. And so these together seem to really enable the evolution of a lot of species quickly in a single place. But it's not clear that we can still, even with that compelling work and those interesting results, that we can still adequately explain some of those extreme cases of diversification that we've looked at already. And so Matt McGee, who was an American scientist working in Ole Seehausen's lab in Switzerland, followed up on some ideas of Ole's to ask if maybe there was some additional factor. And so he did this with an extraordinarily massive piece of research. So he looked at all 1,700, the great majority of known cichlid species, characterized their ecologies, the sorts of environments in which they live in, features of the fish themselves, got some of their DNA sequences to build an evolutionary tree for them all. And he did these large-scale analyses. And so here's a tree he generated. It's something like 40, 50 million years from here out to the edge, which is, the fish of modern times. And what I want to highlight is over here, we have some South American cichlids. These are angelfish you might have seen in aquariums. Here are Oscars. These are familiar fish to anyone who's kept aquaria for very long. And over here, what you're seeing are tree limbs that are varying lengths. There's a few really short ones, but some are really quite long, leading to a few species or a single species. So this is typically what we see in evolutionary trees, which describe the relationships among species. It's, branches of various lengths, and a lot of them quite long. But if we look over here, here's Lake Malawi, hundreds of species over here. And now look at this, all these branches leading to these hundreds of fish, they don't even look like, they're like blades of grass. They're not branches, right? There's almost nothing there because there's been so little time that has elapsed during the evolution of these fishes. Lake Victoria, you can't see branches at all on this sort of scale. It was just so fast. So there's something really unusual happening in some of these systems to generate just mind-bogglingly fast speciation and adaptive radiation. So what could that process be? So Matt and Ole Seehausen suspected that it might be hybridization. So in biology, we usually think of hybridization, which is mating between different species, as being, kind of a sideshow or something that leads to evolutionary dead ends. So this is a mule. Many of you will know that mules are the product of a mating between a horse and a donkey, and they're great pack animals, but they're going nowhere in terms of evolution because they're sterile, right? So this is what we often think of when we think about hybridization. But Ole Seehausen, who oversaw the work that Matt was doing, had the idea some years ago in a paper published almost exactly 20 years ago, April of 2004, that hybridization might actually play a really important role in some of these rapid episodes of diversification. So Ole had the idea that it's not a dead end, but that sometimes when species hybridize, especially if their offspring don't become sterile and so on, if they hybridize, you can mix together really distinct collections of genetic material, and the sum maybe, or the what emerges may be greater than the sum of the parts in terms of that material. So he had the idea that hybridization and this opportunity to mix up all this genetic raw material may act as a kind of rocket fuel for rapid evolutionary diversification. And I remember reading this paper at the time, and I thought, well, that's an interesting idea, but it sure seems speculative, and I'm not sure if you can ever test any of that. But Ole thought you could. And he kept on at this idea, and now they found some extremely interesting results in support of it. So this is one of the most recent studies that they've done. This is by Joanna Meyer, who was a PhD student and a postdoctoral fellow with Ole, and now has her own laboratory at Cambridge. Joanna and Matt and a bunch of other people collaborated on this study where they very carefully looked at the genomes of hundreds of cichlids from all over East Africa, mostly around the area of Lake Victoria. So entire genomes, the whole DNA sequence of an organism, of hundreds and hundreds. And using really sophisticated bioinformatic analyses, they came to the conclusion that the Lake Victoria radiation started with a cross between one group of fishes, of cichlids from the Nile, and then another group of cichlids quite distantly related from the Congo, and that these hybridized in an initial cross. And that gave rise to a single ancestral pool, which diversified. One diversification was in the early form of Lake Victoria, and this was probably something like 100, 200,000 years ago, and you had a radiation there of from this hybrid event. You had fish eaters evolve, and scale eaters, and fish that ate zooplankton in the open water, algae eaters, all these different ecological types of cichlids with all manner of colors and so on, a similar radiation in the nearby Lake Edward system. So this carried on for some time, but then disaster struck. There was a drying about 20,000 years ago. And so at that time, Lake Victoria largely dried up. All that was left was swamps. And they suggest that as it was drying, these various different lineages of cichlids were hybridizing. And so a lot of their genes ended up in just a couple of species living in different parts of the swamp, these kind of generalist cichlids, which harbored a lot of genetic variation. When the lake refilled, these guys, once again, were brought together in the same body of water. They hybridized. There was also probably a little bit of input from the Lake Edward system. And all this material, the product of this earlier diversification, was brought to bear on the ecological opportunity which had arisen once again in Lake Victoria to enable an extremely fast diversification in that system. And so the idea is that Victoria's young system and young fish species have reused through hybridization much older genetic adaptations, for example, for eating fish as prey that had evolved in the early form of Lake Victoria, or maybe even before that. So some of these portions of the genome that are strongly associated with fish eating in Lake Victoria are also associated with fish eating in other systems in rivers and also in lakes all across that region. So it seems like hybridization has enabled the reuse of certain portions of the genome for certain functions over and over again, which is a really very different way of looking at adaptive radiation and looking at evolution than what most of us are familiar with. And it's noteworthy and kind of comforting that some similar results are also emerging from Lake Malawi, that other system that we highlighted. So in Lake Malawi, we also see evidence of the merging of quite distantly related fish at the very start of the diversification there, and also of later episodes of hybridization, giving rise to further episodes of diversification in the Lake Malawi system, in those cichlids. But in addition to explaining how new species arise, it's also important as evolutionary biologists to try and explain how variation persists within species, as it must do sometimes if we're going to have raw material for diversification. And so I wrote a chapter about this in the book. It's got kind of a goofy name. It's Cricket, Cabers, and the Sinister Advantage. So I chose that name because what I wanted to do in this chapter was highlight some of the analogies between things that happen in certain sports, right? And some of the processes that take place in certain sports, and what happens in populations of fish and other animals to maintain genetic variation within species. So I'll pose a little question for you to think about right now as we get into this. So which of these sports do you think might have the strongest analogy to what happens in fish in Lake Tanganyika? Caber tossing, which is it really is a sport done by some of my distant relations in Scotland, where a fella in a kilt takes a huge log and throws it end over end as far as he can. Swimming, that seems like it could be analogous to what fish do, right? That's kind of plausible. Or cricket. Well, cricket is a popular sport where I grew up in British Columbia. It's very much like baseball. It turns out that it's cricket And so let me explain now why cricket is like what fish do in Lake Tanganyika. Let's come back to the fish to start off. So this is a scale-eating cichlid, a Perissodus microlepis from Lake Tanganyika. And what you can see is that the mouths of these fish are bent a little bit. This one is bent towards the left, and this one is bent towards the right. So why is that? Well, the way they make their living is they swim up to larger fish and bite a chunk of scales off them. They love scales. If you try to raise them in aquaria, scales are what they want. And they swim up from behind because, of course, prey fish don't want their scales eaten. So here's a prey fish. What the Perissodus do is they kind of swim up from behind, and then at the last minute, they dart in kind of from the back and the side a little bit and grab a mouthful of scales from the prey fish and swim off. All right. So they don't want to be seen. They want to sneak up. So you can imagine if you're coming in from the right side, having a mouth that's bent a little bit might give you a better purchase, allow you to get a better grip on your prey and grab some scales really hard and pull them off. So that explains why the mouths are twisted a little bit. But let's imagine that we are in Lake Tanganyika and we've got various prey fish swimming around, and we've got these Perissodus, and the Perissodus have all the ability to attack from the right, and their mouths have all bent a little bit so they can get a good bite from the right. Well, if they're all attacking from the right all the time, of course, the prey fish are going to be paying attention. They're going to start to watch things behind them and to the right. And so the scale eaters are going to start to have kind of a tough time getting access to these scales. So in that scenario, let's imagine now that everybody's attacking from the right, that a mutant appears that attacks from the left. Okay. So the prey fish are all watching to the right. So that Perissodus that's attacking from the left, it's going to the buffet, right? So there's going to be plenty for it to eat because the prey are completely unprepared. So they should do well. They should get lots to eat. They should survive well. They should have lots of babies and leave lots of their genes in the next generation. So we expect the alleles, the genes for attacking from the left to become more common. Well, what happens if attacking from the left becomes really common? Now the prey fish are all watching to the left, and you're better off to be attacking from the right. So the idea is that in general, whatever's rare, whatever strategy is rare is the one that's going to have the greatest success in that system. So we call this frequency dependence, and we think this can maintain variation in nature because it'll always be providing advantage to whatever's rare, and that should maintain lots of variation. That is actually a lot like what happens in certain sports. So if you are a cricketer, if you're a batsman, your job is to prevent the ball from hitting these wickets right here, these sticks. Now, most bowlers are going to be right-handed because most people are right-handed. So a bowler is like a pitcher. So the batsman is going to be really accustomed to defending his wickets against balls that are hurled from the right. And that have a certain trajectory that comes, down and from the right, and maybe has a certain predictable sort of bounce. So they're going to be good at that. So what happens if now a bowler appears who bowls from the left, which is only 10 or 12% of the population, most human populations? Well, that's going to be an unfamiliar style of attack, and it's going to be tougher for that batsman to defend his wickets. And so what we see is at the highest levels of cricket, there are way more left-handed bowlers than there should be based upon their frequency in the population. It's not 10%, it's much higher. And you see the same thing if you look at a bullpen in Major League Baseball. There's a lot more lefties than there should be if they were just represented as they are in the population. And it's not just those sports. So if you look at boxing, southpaws, people who attack with their left, again, overrepresented. And some of the most extreme examples are actually fencing. So in fencing, in some forms of fencing, the frequency of lefties gets up to almost 50%. So it gets very, very high. That's different, right? That's different from what happens in swimming. So in all these sports, we have close interaction between two individuals, and there's an advantage to rare strategies. In swimming, being left-handed does not make you any faster, and you're not interacting closely with your competitors, so it has no effect. There's no lefty advantage in swimming, nor in caber tossing. Being left-handed does not help you throw that log any further. So certain sports have this frequency-dependent advantage, just like what we see in these scale eaters in Lake Tanganyika. I want to shift now away from Africa and tell you a little bit about Lake Baikal, which we've referenced briefly already, in Siberia at a far higher latitude. And we're going to start with another little sort of fun quiz. And I'm going to ask you if you can spot the ancient lake researcher. And all these people will be Russian or Soviet. So what do you think? Is that an ancient lake researcher or not? I think a lot of folks will recognize that that is, in fact, Joseph Stalin, who, to the best of my knowledge, never published any papers on ancient lakes. He did lead the Soviet Union for a long time, and was arguably a sort of a criminal. But anyway, what about this one? Ancient lake researcher? Turns out it is. That is Olga Kozova, and she worked on Lake Baikal. She was a professor for some years at Irkutsk State University. This one, a few folks might recognize this guy. This is Nikita Khrushchev. So he came a little bit after Stalin, also a Soviet leader. More folks might recognize this one. Again, not an ancient lake researcher. This is Mikhail Gorbachev, who led the Soviet Union in the 1980s, something like that. 90s, maybe. This one, what do you think? Ancient lake researcher? One, both? Well, this is the interesting part. So this is Professor Mikhail Kozov here, and he started his career and started working on Lake Baikal at about the time of Joseph Stalin. And he carried on a sampling scheme there through the various changes in the Soviet leadership over decades. And then his children, well, his daughter, Olga, took over and was followed by her daughter. This is Lyubov Izmestova, who I've corresponded with a little bit and provided me with some of these photographs. She too was a professor at Irkutsk State University. All three of them were. And what they did was they did this systematic sampling of Lake Baikal. And Baikal, by the way, is really important in Russian culture and literature, as we can see in this quote from Chekhov. So Professor Kozov, starting in 1945, at the time of Stalin, started going out every 2 weeks, first in a boat to Lake Baikal, and we go to the very same spot on the lake, a ways offshore, not too far from Irkutsk. And he would lower some equipment into the water and at various depths collect chemical samples and samples of the algae living there and the tiny plankton and so on. So he would make these systematic collections at different depths in the lake every couple of weeks, all summer. And then he kept at it through Siberian winters, which are serious winters. And so then he had to wait until the ice had formed, and he would drive out onto the lake and drill a hole into it and lower his equipment again and start collecting these samples. So Lake Baikal, because of this one unusual family of scientists, provides us with some of the longest and most complete limnological records of any system on the planet. And that's been really important to our understanding of things like global warming and how it's changing ecologies. I'm not going to talk about their work so much. I want to tell you just about some of the marvels of Lake Baikal and why it's kind of a mad place. So the first one is the sponge forests of Baikal. If you look at this picture, to me, it has a really otherworldly aspect, and it certainly looks like a marine system. That's what my friends who are scuba divers who work in the ocean are sure of. They say, well, it's got to be marine. It's not. These are sponge forests found in Lake Baikal around a big chunk of the lake between about 30 and 60 feet in depth. They're only native to Baikal. They're part of a radiation of sponges there. And they have algae living in their tissues, which is why they're green, and that enables them to be so successful. So a very strange environment. Baikal is also a bit mad in terms of the fish that have diversified there. So the fish that have diversified in Baikal are sculpins, and I don't know anywhere else in the world where sculpins do the sorts of things ecologically that they do in Lake Baikal. And there are 30 plus species of these found entirely within the lake. And we're going to do one last sort of quiz game here, and I'm going to ask you, which of these things do you think is the fattiest? And one of them is a Lake Baikal sculpin, and we'll explain a little bit about their biology from the answer. So, which is the fattiest? Cheddar cheese, brie cheese, hamburger, or the Golomyanka sculpin of Lake Baikal? Well, cheddar cheese is pretty fatty. It's about a third fat. According to the website I read, it's probably the heaviest of cheeses. And you can get some pretty fatty hamburger if you look for it. And, brie does okay. But none of them can hold a candle to Lake Baikal's Golomyanka, which is 40% fat. So my Siberian colleagues tell me that if you collect one of these things and forget it out in the sun, you'll come back a little while later and it'll basically melt it. All the fat will have drained away, and you'll have some internal organs and a few bones left from this fish. So why is this fish comprised so much of fat? It's basically because sculpins are not really well suited to living in the open water of the lake like the Golomianka does. What sculpins are good at is sitting on the bottom. Most sculpins have fat contents which are much lower. For example, 3% would not be unusual in sculpins. They're heavy animals and they sit on the bottom, and all they do is, feed on things off the bottom, whether they're living in a lake or a stream or in the ocean. And in fact, they don't even have a swim bladder. So a swim bladder is this feature present in most fish that allows them to maintain stable buoyancy in the water. Sculpins don't have it. So it's very difficult for them to evolve into a form that lives in the open waters of a lake. But presumably when they arrived in Lake Baikal, that was an opportunity for them. So some of them evolved really light bones, but the Golomianka evolved, in addition to light bones and big pectoral fins to kind of fly through the water, this very high fat content, which makes them lighter and allows them to stay stable in the water. Final odd bit of Lake Baikal is that Lake Baikal holds a sort of deep sea vent. So many lakes have methane bubbling up at the bottom, and some very deep lakes have it. But typically in those really deep lakes, when the methane comes up, there's no oxygen. So it can support a community of bacteria that can make their living from the methane, but that's about it. But in Lake Baikal, unusually, it has oxygen all the way to its depths, and it's the deepest lake in the world at over 1,600 meters, over a mile. And so various other animals can live at these depths and can make their living from the energy provided ultimately from these bacteria. So there are snails and flatworms and amphipods and fish and all kinds of things basically making their living from methane that's bubbling up from the bottom of Lake Baikal. And so you get creatures like these, this almost pigmentless sculpin that lives in the bottom of the lake where it never sees any sunlight and has almost lost its ability to see, or this giant flatworm. These things are over a foot long, these giant predatory flatworms, the stuff of nightmares and horror shows. All right. In writing the book, I didn't really want to spend a lot of time on the threats to the lakes. I wanted to spend most of the book on celebrating them. It'd be irresponsible not to say a little bit about some of the worries that we have about what's going on in the lakes. And I'll just tell you one story that's especially illustrative, and that's of Lake Lanao, which is this lake in the Philippines that was first studied in the early 20th century. And there, 18 species of and this is not a really large lake, 18 species of saprinid fish, which are minnows and that sort of thing, were discovered that were extraordinarily ecologically diverse. They were just marveled at by the ichthyologists who worked on them. But Lake Lanao has had a tough time. There's been farming around it, a lot of algae blooms. There have been a lot of fish introduced. It's been overfished. And it's an area that's hard to manage because it's really politically unstable. So the last time folks went back, they could only find 2 of those 18 endemic species. So it seems like most of the radiation present in Lanao has been lost. That's an extreme case, but these very same stresses are present in most of the world's ancient lakes and are indeed causing extinctions, although fortunately most things are not as bad as they are there. This is an issue not just because some of us care about biodiversity and conservation, but also because these lakes often provide really important ecosystem services, like large amounts of the protein that are consumed by people living around the lakes. So the lakes are really important for nourishing our bodies. But I would also argue that the lakes have been important to nourishing our souls. One of the most enjoyable things I did in preparing this book was to collect quotations from colleagues all over the world that illustrate the importance of these systems to the cultures around the lakes. And I've got these at the start of each chapter. And these are a couple of my favorites. One from Indonesia in the Pomona language that my friend Yusri Nilawati found for me. I know a little bit of Indonesian, but no Pomona, so I can't appreciate the original, but the translation is so pretty. Busy village, the beauty of Lake Poso, beautiful to behold by the sun. There is peace in the longing heart. Or this famous haiku, written by Basho, apparently one of the most important composers of haiku in 1690. You can read for yourself about Lake Biwa. That's also very pretty in translation, at least. So what then are the prospects for the lakes as we move into the 21st century? I'm not going to say a whole lot about that, so I'll just close by with a couple of quotations from the book, from my final section on the prospects for the lakes. So these are the summation of my thoughts. With foresight and timely action, I think it is possible that much ancient lake biodiversity can endure the difficult spell that we're going to have the next few decades. So I'm not sure I'm optimistic, but I am hopeful enough at least to have written this book. A lot of folks helped me with it. I can't thank them all, but I'll just show you here how extensive that list is. And I'll say thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Dr. McKinnon, thank you very much. I'll encourage everybody in the chat to drop their round of applause for you as appreciation. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, as you alluded to early on in the talk, I don't think I had ever heard of ancient lakes, and I've been hanging out in this science and nature business for a little while. So this is pretty fascinating stuff. The evolutionary radiations particularly are tremendous.
Yeah, they're wonders in and of themselves. They're wonders of natural history, and you can visit them. Like Lake Tanganyika, you can get to, and it's an extraordinary place to visit. So I encourage folks to do that. But what's even more important, or well, just as important as biologists, is that they are revealing, these principles of nature that we really had not appreciated, and the potentially really critical role of hybridization in diversification. And we didn't know about that until we could get all these genomes. So now that we can get all this DNA, we can see where the genes started and where they moved to and what their histories are and track individual genes. And it's really changing our view of the world very rapidly.
Yeah, no doubt. Very, very cool stuff. All right, we've got a few minutes left in the program. So viewers, drop some questions for me in the chat now that you're downloading the presentation into your brain and some thoughts are emerging. Let me know about them. One question that did come up for you is, how is the age of a lake determined? How do you know that they're ancient?
That is getting into a realm that's a little bit beyond my particular expertise, but it's largely through the geology. So I am going to defer to the geologists on that one. But you can do calculations sometimes simply if you know, for example, how fast a fault is separating. You can make inferences based on how fast that is happening as to how much time must have transpired to create a lake of that depth or an object of that scale. But they use a variety of other methods, and so some of it, no doubt, is the same sorts of tools that we use for aging fossils, where we can look at the decay of radioisotopes one into another, and based upon the relative abundance of different isotopes, make inferences about how old a particular piece of rock is. So those are the sorts of tools, but I'm more of a biologist than a geologist, so sometimes I trust them to get it right a little bit. It's a good question.
And then what were the ancient lakes in the United States?
So let me go back to that figure. We arguably have ancient lakes in the United States. So you can see here Lake Tool and Lake Tahoe. Tool's up in Washington, Tahoe a little bit further south. But although they're arguably ancient, and Tahoe is reasonably old, they just don't have the sort of diversifications that we've seen elsewhere. And it's hard to say if that's got more to do with the creatures that happen to colonize them, or maybe they've experienced some disturbances along the way that have caused extinctions that we're not really aware of. So maybe they haven't been continuously occupied by single lineages for all that time, even though they are reasonably old. So we do have a few in North America, but we just don't have any of the same sorts of diversifications that we see in some of the lakes elsewhere.
Good questions. Let's see. Next one. Are cichlids a good fish to compare across the United States for adaptive radiation?
No, there are cichlids in the United States, but they're all introduced. So you'll find them some populations in Florida. It's probably some in Texas as well. So they're here, but they shouldn't be. There are some that are native. I don't think they're any that are native to the U.S. They are in parts of Mexico and Central America. There and South America for sure. There are native cichlids. So they're not great for studying here. There's things like sunfish and salmonids and stickleback fish that I work on are better suited for the study of diversification radiation in North America.
Good question. Let's see. Have you visited all of the ancient lakes?
No, I'm still trying. So no, I'm glad I got to Baikal when I did. I've been to a lot of them, but a couple that I haven't been to are Titicaca. I used to work in Peru years ago. I worked actually on dolphin ecology as a graduate student. And so I was through a fair chunk of Peru, but I never got to Titicaca. So that's still on my list. I will go this summer to Lake Ohrid. Fortunately, my family is enthusiastic about it too. It's an interesting part of the world. It's on the border between North Macedonia and Albania. So I'm not sure if this is still up, but yeah, so just in central Eastern Europe there. So there's a few that I still have to get to. I have been to all the big African ones and a bunch of the ones in Southeast Asia and Japan and a few other places, but no, I haven't gotten to them all yet.
Just racking up those flyer miles, yeah.
It's in a guilty way, yeah. I buy carbon offsets to assuage my guilt a little bit, knowing full well that they are not entirely satisfactory.
Right. Well, let's see. We're pretty much out of time for lunchtime discovery series. I know the folks who watch this program probably wrapping up their lunches now that it's after 1 o'clock. But Dr. McKinnon, thanks for being with us. This is fascinating.
Well, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to tell people about these marvelous systems. So thank you.
Absolutely. And everybody, again, the book was Our Ancient Lakes, A Natural History by Dr. Jeffrey McKinnon. Thanks for tuning in today. We were going to drop some links in the chat, I think. Probably you can also, y'all know how to use the internet. You made it here. You can give it a Google to find the book or to find Dr. McKinnon's research if you wanted to learn more about his work at East Carolina University as well. So thanks for joining us today for the program. Of course, we'll be back here again next Wednesday at noon with another edition of the Lunchtime Discovery Series from the Office of Environmental Education and Museum of Natural Sciences. Thanks to the museum's digital media team, Hannah, for broadcasting today's production, for doing a great job. And again, thanks to you, our guest speaker, for being here today. Everybody, we'll see you next time. Be safe, be well. Enjoy the rest of your week. We'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.